Worst prison food in Russia. Survival behind bars. The walls are cold, the corridors echo with footsteps, and the smell of overcooked cabbage fills the air. If you think prison life is harsh in fiction, this is reality, and it starts with what you eat. Hit subscribe now to uncover the shocking truth behind Russia's prison kitchens. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All factual information is drawn from publicly available court records, investigative journalism, and reports by the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, BBC News, and the Moscow Times. Unverified details are clearly labeled. The arrival. The train slowed to a halt at a remote station in Siberia. Outside, a dense gray mist rolled over snow-covered fields, hiding the perimeter of the prison in a ghostly haze. For Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, a first-time offender, stepping off the transport meant entering a world where survival began at the dinner tray. According to reports, new arrivals in Russian penal colonies often face an intake process designed as much to test mental resilience as to record personal details. The smell of wet concrete, unwashed bodies, and stale bread hit immediately. Inside, guards moved with precise authority, their eyes scanning for any sign of weakness. A fellow inmate whispered, "If you want to last, don't eat everything they give you. Sometimes it's safer to ration." Alexei, barely understanding the system, was led past a dining hall that looked more like a military mess hall than a place for human sustenance. Rows of long tables were set with thin metal trays, each carrying a modest portion of watery cabbage soup, a single slice of coarse bread, and a cup of tepid broth. A leaked 2019 report by the Russian Public Monitoring Commission confirms this pattern across several penal colonies. Meals served to inmates are nutritionally deficient, often lacking sufficient protein or calories. According to testimony from former prisoners reported by the Moscow Times, 2018, portions are designed to minimize costs and can function as a form of passive punishment. Tension and investigation, the meal as punishment. Alexei's first bite of cabbage soup was a shock. The flavor was bitter, the consistency watery, and floating chunks of root vegetables felt more like filler than nutrition. "I couldn't eat it all," he muttered, pushing the tray away slightly. A nearby inmate, Sergei pseudonym, smirked, "You'll get used to it or you won't last." This kind of exchange is not unusual. Accounts from multiple sources indicate a culture where survival often depends on social learning among inmates. Inspection of the kitchen, as reported by human rights activists, reveals a system fraught with neglect. Refrigeration is often limited, storage areas infested with rodents, and food prep is overseen by a small number of staff, sometimes with minimal supervision. Inmates report that these conditions lead to spoilage, contamination, and illness, although official documentation remains sparse. The Public Monitoring Commission notes that malnutrition and scurvy have been observed in older facilities, particularly in remote regions such as Siberia and the Russian Far East. The social dynamic around meals is another layer of danger. Inmates often trade, hoard, or steal rations to survive, which fuels tension and occasional violence. According to reports, fights over food are not uncommon, particularly in maximum security sections. Guards may allow minor conflicts to settle naturally as a disciplinary lesson, adding a psychological dimension to the punishment inherent in mealtime. By the end of his first week, Alexei had lost several kilograms. Fatigue settled into his bones, and minor illnesses, headaches, nausea, and chronic hunger became constant companions. According to a 2017 investigation by BBC News, inmates described the diet as both physically weakening and psychologically oppressive. One former prisoner said, "You eat, but you don't feel nourished. You feel small, weak, invisible." As Alexei lay in the bunk that night, listening to the distant clatter of trays and muffled shouts in the corridor, He realized that survival here was not just about following rules, it was about outlasting the system itself. The meal trays, innocuous to the outside world, were a quiet but relentless instrument of control. And then, according to unconfirmed reports circulating among inmates, a rare event occurred. One of the guards, unusually, smuggled in extra rations for certain prisoners, creating a tense hierarchy among the newcomers. Who would get it? And who would pay the cost? That question lingered in Alexei's mind as the lights dimmed. Hunger is not just an inconvenience here, it is a weapon. Every tray, every portion, is part of a system designed to test endurance and obedience. Subscribe now, because what happens next will shock you. High stakes opening, the hunger deepens. By the second week, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym had begun to notice a pattern. Every meal was a battle. Watered-down cabbage soup, occasional slices of stale bread, and near-constant cold tea were standard. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, this is typical in many penal colonies across Russia, particularly in Siberian facilities, where extreme isolation and harsh conditions amplify the effects of malnutrition. A fellow inmate, Nikolai pseudonym, who had survived 3 years in a similar colony, whispered warnings. "You'll find yourself dreaming of bread that's not stale," he said. Hunger drove desperation, and desperation drove conflict. Inmates began rationing their meager portions or trading small favors for extra food. According to unconfirmed inmate testimonies, these informal trades sometimes spiraled into disputes or even violence in common areas. The psychological toll was immediate. Weakness and fatigue left Alexei unable to perform basic tasks without exhaustion. Inmates described nausea, headaches, and chronic lethargy as routine symptoms. Medical inspections, according to leaked internal reports, were inconsistent, leaving many prisoners to suffer in silence. In some cases, scurvy, anemia, and malnutrition were documented, particularly among those in remote northern colonies. Tension and investigation, the hidden hierarchy. Food in Russian prisons serves more than nutritional needs, it functions as a tool of social control. Guards reportedly distribute small privileges in the form of slightly larger portions or extra bread to compliant inmates. According to BBC News, 2017, some penal colonies have documented instances where select prisoners received preferential treatment, creating a subtle hierarchy that can incite tension and resentment. Alexei observed this hierarchy forming within his cell block. Inmates who received extra portions were treated with grudging respect, while newcomers or those who displeased the guards risked being last in line or receiving the smallest trays. Exchanges were carefully monitored. Rumors of extra rations spread quickly, creating suspicion and a constant atmosphere of tension. The situation worsened when Alexei noticed a fellow inmate, Sergei quietly collecting small portions from others' trays. This kind of behavior, according to unverified reports circulating among prisoners, sometimes escalated to threats or assault. It highlighted how survival relied not just on enduring hunger, but on navigating complex inmate hierarchies and psychological pressures. Illness and desperation. By the end of the second week, Alexei's health began to deteriorate. Fatigue had deepened, and mild gastrointestinal issues became chronic. According to testimony compiled by human rights observers, symptoms like this are common in Russian penal colonies due to consistently low-calorie meals and poor hygiene. A sudden incident intensified the tension. During one meal, a tray fell, spilling soup across the floor. Guards ignored the minor accident, leaving inmates to scramble for the wasted portions. According to unconfirmed reports, such small incidents often triggered fights, as prisoners feared missing even a single calorie. Alexei realized that survival depended not only on enduring the food, but also on outlasting the social and psychological challenges of the prison hierarchy. The stakes were no longer theoretical, they were life-threatening. And just as he began calculating how to ration his portions, he overheard whispers of a planned inspection by higher authorities, a rare event that, according to unverified accounts, sometimes caused sudden changes in rationing and stricter control measures. The tension hung in the air like the lingering smell of overcooked cabbage. Would the inspection bring relief, or would it further tighten the noose around the prisoner's already scarce resources? Hunger drives desperation, and desperation sparks conflict. In Russian prisons, every tray can become a battlefield. Subscribe now. This story is only getting darker. High stakes, opening, escalating hunger and tension. By the third week, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, had learned the harsh truth. The meager rations were only part of the struggle. According to reports by the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, malnutrition in Russian penal colonies is widespread, particularly in remote or overcrowded facilities. Inmates frequently endure meals that provide insufficient calories, protein, and vitamins. Fatigue had deepened. Muscle weakness made even basic chores exhausting. According to BBC News, 2017, chronic hunger and malnutrition in these prisons can exacerbate psychological stress, leading to irritability, aggression, and anxiety. Guards observed these behavioral changes but often responded with punitive measures rather than nutritional support. Alexei noticed subtle signs of rebellion and tension among the inmates. Some began hoarding small portions of bread or soup, while others attempted to trade favors for extra rations. This informal economy, according to unverified inmate testimonies, sometimes escalated into verbal threats and physical confrontations in the dining hall, demonstrating how scarcity can ignite conflict. Tension and investigation of the battle for food. The dining hall had become a strategic arena. Inmates jostled for position in line, carefully watching guards and fellow prisoners alike. Some of the more seasoned inmates, according to reports from human rights observers, leveraged their seniority or connections to secure slightly larger portions. Alexei saw an altercation between two prisoners over a spilled portion of soup. While minor, the incident revealed the fragile balance within the cell block. Witness accounts collected by the Moscow Times, 2018, confirm that fights over meals are common in penal colonies, fueled by both hunger and psychological strain. Meanwhile, health issues continued to mount. Alexei began experiencing persistent dizziness and headaches, a condition consistent with early-stage malnutrition reported in multiple investigations of Russian penal colonies. Observers have documented cases where inmates develop anemia, scurvy, and digestive disorders due to poor nutrition and unsanitary food conditions. Power, fear, and survival. On one particularly cold morning, Alexei noticed a small group of inmates quietly trading portions of bread and soup in a corner. According to unverified sources, these exchanges sometimes solidify informal alliances or hierarchies, granting certain inmates minor privileges or protection, but also creating potential enemies. A sudden shout from a guard disrupted the transaction. Tensions spiked as everyone froze, realizing that one misstep could result in punishment. Alexei understood that survival was not only about enduring the hunger, it was about navigating the delicate power structures that governed daily life in the prison. As the day ended, Alexei returned to his bunk, calculating how to stretch his rations and avoid confrontation. Outside, snow fell silently over the prison yard, indifferent to the suffering inside. Yet, according to unconfirmed inmate reports, higher authorities were scheduled for another inspection soon, an event that could temporarily improve conditions, or tighten control and rationing even further. The stakes were escalating, and Alexei realized that each meal, each glance, and each interaction could decide his survival. The system was relentless, and the hunger was only getting worse. Hunger gnaws not only at the body but at the mind. Every tray carries a lesson in survival, every bite a gamble with strength, health, and alliances. Subscribe now. This is the reality few dare to witness. High stakes opening, the daily struggle intensifies. It was mid-morning, and the bitter Siberian wind swept across the prison yard, rattling the iron gates and echoing through the high concrete walls. Inside, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, sat hunched over a metal tray, staring at the pale, watery cabbage soup. According to the Moscow Times, 2018, and multiple reports by the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, meals in remote penal colonies are consistently nutritionally deficient, with portions designed to minimize costs rather than support inmates' health. Alexei's muscles ached from the constant strain of performing basic chores on an empty stomach. Sleep had become fitful, interrupted by hunger pangs and tension among the inmates. This physical depletion, corroborated by BBC News, 2017 investigations, mirrors documented cases where chronic malnutrition in Russian prisons leads to fatigue, dizziness, and increased susceptibility to illness. The dining hall, once merely a place to eat, had become a tense theater of observation. Inmates watched one another for signs of weakness or desperation. Survival depended not only on rationing food, but also on reading social cues and understanding the unspoken hierarchy that dictated who got what. Alexei quickly realized that each meal was an exercise in both physical endurance and psychological navigation. Tension and investigation, alliances, rivalries, and the hunger economy. Across the hall, a small group of prisoners quietly exchanged portions of bread and soup. According to unverified inmate accounts, these exchanges often solidified informal alliances. Inmates with minor privileges, extra rations, warmer clothes, or access to scarce toiletries could leverage these for protection or favors. Those without allies faced subtle ostracism, bullying, or, in extreme cases, physical intimidation. Alexei watched one altercation escalate. A newcomer, trying to take slightly more soup than his share, was shouted at by a senior inmate. The argument, according to witness statements reported by human rights observers, almost turned violent before guards intervened. Such incidents are frequent in Russian prisons where scarcity and stress intersect. Hunger fuels conflict, and small incidents can escalate quickly. Medical consequences of poor nutrition were becoming impossible to ignore. Alexei noticed fellow inmates with pale skin, brittle hair, and persistent coughing, a pattern consistent with documented deficiencies in protein, vitamins, and essential minerals. According to reports compiled by the Public Monitoring Commission, cases of anemia, scurvy, and gastrointestinal issues are common among prisoners in Siberian and Far Eastern colonies. The combination of cold temperatures, high physical demands, and inadequate diet amplifies these effects. Psychological impact: fear, desperation, and control. Psychologically, the constant hunger created an undercurrent of fear. Alexei found himself obsessively calculating how to stretch every portion of bread or soup. Every minor spill, every dropped portion, could trigger conflict or punishment. According to unconfirmed inmate reports, guards sometimes allow minor skirmishes to unfold, reinforcing a sense of hierarchy and obedience among the prisoners. The inspection by higher authorities, scheduled periodically but irregularly, loomed as both a potential relief and a source of new stress. During these inspections, rations could temporarily increase or be redistributed, but the process also intensified scrutiny. Inmates who were perceived as troublemakers risked losing even the meager privileges they had cultivated through alliances or trade. The system, as Alexei observed, was designed to constantly test endurance, obedience, and social cunning. The unexpected intervention. Late one evening, as Alexei returned to his bunk, he noticed a small delivery of additional bread and canned goods left outside a side door. According to unverified accounts from inmates, such deliveries occasionally occur, sometimes as a reward, sometimes as a test, and sometimes due to corruption or bribery within the system. The entire cell block immediately buzzed with speculation. Who had access to these extra portions? Was it a reward, a trap, or merely a random act? The tension was palpable, as everyone understood that claiming too much could provoke anger, and claiming too little could mean continued suffering. Alexei, exhausted and hungry, faced a dilemma. Take a portion and risk conflict, or wait and trust his instincts. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that survival in this prison was not only about enduring the harsh food but also navigating the treacherous human dynamics amplified by scarcity. Outside, the Siberian wind howled, echoing the uncertainty inside. And in the quiet corridors of the colony, unconfirmed whispers of inspections, ration manipulations, and potential unrest spread through the prisoners like wildfire. The night settled over the prison yard, but the hunger, tension, and fear were relentless. Alexei understood that in this environment, every day, every meal, and every decision could mean the difference between survival and collapse. Hunger is no longer a background problem. It's shaping alliances, fueling fear, and determining who survive. Subscribe now to witness the harsh reality behind Russia's prison kitchens. High-stakes opening health crises emerge. By the fifth week, the effects of malnutrition were increasingly visible among the prisoners. Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, noticed pale complexions, frail postures, and frequent fainting among inmates. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, prisons in Siberia and the Russian Far East often serve meals lacking essential calories, protein, and vitamins, resulting in documented cases of anemia, scurvy, and other nutritional deficiencies. Medical staff in these facilities are stretched thin. Routine checkups are infrequent, and treatment for nutrition-related illnesses is inconsistent. According to BBC News, 2017, some inmates go weeks without receiving adequate intervention for preventable illnesses caused by poor diet. For Alexei, this meant living day-to-day with constant fatigue and susceptibility to minor infections, which could quickly escalate if untreated. As he trudged to the dining hall, the tension among inmates was palpable. Weakness, hunger, and psychological strain had begun to fracture the already fragile social order. Observers note that prolonged malnutrition in high-stress environments increases irritability, depression, and the likelihood of conflict, conditions that the prison hierarchy appeared to exploit, consciously or otherwise. Tension and investigation, conflicts and strategies. The dining hall was a theater of subtle manipulation and survival strategies. Alexei watched as inmates strategically positioned themselves near guards or more experienced prisoners to secure slightly better portions. According to unverified testimonies, some prisoners leveraged minor favors, threats, or alliances to obtain extra rations, while others endured scorn or outright intimidation if they lacked connections. A minor incident escalated one day. A tray of soup was accidentally spilled, and a heated argument broke out between two inmates. Guards intervened, but the altercation highlighted how scarcity intensified social tension. According to the Moscow Times, 2018, disputes over food in Russian penal colonies are not uncommon, and even small skirmishes can have lasting consequences, shaping relationships and hierarchies within the cell block. Alexei began to experiment with rationing, hoarding small amounts for later, and quietly observing the behavior of other inmates. Survival was increasingly mental as much as physical, understanding the rules of informal power and predicting how fellow prisoners would act became crucial. Psychological impact, fear, control, and isolation. The psychological strain was compounded by isolation and uncertainty. According to human rights reports, inmates in remote Russian penal colonies often experience extreme mental fatigue due to combination of poor diet, harsh climate, and restricted communication. Alexei noticed himself becoming hyper-aware of minor behaviors, A glance, a whispered word, or a sudden movement could indicate threat or opportunity. The hunger itself was a psychological tool. Guards appeared indifferent to complaints, and meals were routinely described by inmates as meager, monotonous, and unpalatable. According to documented testimonies, the monotony and scarcity contributed to heightened anxiety and sometimes passive compliance, reinforcing control through deprivation. As Alexei navigated this environment, he realized that survival required constant vigilance, adaptation, and negotiation. Every interaction, whether with guards or fellow inmates, had consequences, particularly when rations were scarce or inspections were imminent. Inspection looms. Word spread through the cell block of an approaching inspection by higher authorities, a rare event in Russian penal colonies. According to unverified inmate reports, inspections can temporarily improve conditions or shift rations, but they also intensify tension as both guards and inmates adjust their behavior. Alexei observed that some prisoners hoarded food in anticipation, while others feigned compliance to gain minor privileges. The atmosphere in the cell block was electric, a combination of fear, anticipation, and subtle strategy. Would the inspection provide relief, or would it expose those unprepared for scrutiny? The night settled over the prison, snow covering the yard outside, but inside the cells, the hunger, tension, and uncertainty were relentless. Alexei knew that the inspection could change everything, and for some, it might mean the difference between survival and suffering. Weeks of hunger, tension, and psychological strain have pushed prisoners to the edge. What happens when survival becomes a daily battle? Subscribe now to uncover the shocking truth behind Russian prison meals. High-stakes opening, the aftermath of the inspection. The inspection by higher authorities had come and gone, leaving a ripple of temporary change. According to unverified inmate reports, rations were slightly increased for a brief period, fresh cabbage was delivered, and small quantities of meat appeared on some trays. Guards monitored the cell blocks closely, correcting minor infractions and rewarding compliant prisoners. Alexei Ivanov, pseudonym, noticed the change immediately. The trays were slightly heavier, the soup less watery, and the bread marginally fresher. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018, such inspections are designed to assert control and demonstrate compliance, rather than provide long-term improvement in living conditions. Yet, the brief relief highlighted the underlying reality. Hunger was a constant, systemic tool of control, and the small improvements could vanish overnight. The psychological toll on prisoners persisted, as they remained aware that conditions would revert once the inspection ended. Tension and investigation, consequences of chronic malnutrition. Even with slightly improved rations, the effects of chronic malnutrition were undeniable. According to BBC News, 2017, and other human rights reports, inmates often suffer weakened immune systems, fatigue, cognitive decline, and psychological strain due to prolonged inadequate diet. In Alexei's cell block, disputes still flared over limited portions. Inmates jockeyed for position, traded favors, and subtly negotiated alliances to secure food. Unverified testimonies indicate that these micropolitical maneuvers sometimes determined who survived relatively unscathed and who succumbed to weakness or illness. Medical reports confirm that even brief improvements cannot reverse months of undernourishment. Inmates frequently experienced headaches, dizziness, and digestive problems. Some were hospitalized for severe complications caused by the consistent lack of nutrient. Alexei himself felt the lingering fatigue and joint pain, a reminder that survival required resilience beyond mere willpower. Psychological impact, endurance, adaptation, and survival. Psychologically, prisoners developed coping strategies. According to documented sources, inmates learned to ration, trade, and anticipate guard behavior to manage scarce resources. Hunger became not only a physical challenge but also a tool for developing vigilance and strategic thinking. Alexei observed the emergence of informal leaders within the cell block, prisoners who could navigate both guard expectations and inmate alliances. These individuals often secured slightly better portions or protection, highlighting how scarcity shaped the social hierarchy. According to unverified reports, some conflicts over food escalated into fights, though authorities sometimes intervened to maintain control. Despite small victories and temporary relief, the overall environment remained harsh. Food scarcity, cold, and isolation continued to exert pressure on every inmate, reinforcing the relentless nature of survival behind bars. The reality behind the walls. As the final week of Alexei's first month approached, the brief inspection ended and rations returned to their usual inadequate portions. The cycle of hunger, tension, and subtle violence resumed, illustrating the persistent reality of Russian prison life. According to official reports and investigative journalism, the system continues to prioritize control and cost saving over prisoner health and well-being. Alexei sat on his bunk, staring at the tray of soup before him. Every bite reminded him of the months ahead, the physical and psychological challenges, and the constant negotiation required to survive. He understood now that in this environment, food was both sustenance and punishment, a measure of endurance, resilience, and adaptability. The story concludes not with dramatic resolution or heroic triumph, but with a stark truth. Life behind bars in Russia is unforgiving, and the struggle for survival begins with something as basic as a meal. Disclaimer: this story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy. All factual information is drawn from publicly available court records, investigative journalism, and reports by the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, BBC News, and the Moscow Times. Unverified details are clearly labeled. The struggle isn't over. Hunger, hierarchy, and survival rules tighten their grip with each passing day. Subscribe now. What you're about to see is the reality behind the prison walls. High-stakes opening. The cold returns. Winter deepened in Siberia, blanketing the prison yard with snow and frost that crept into every corner of the facility. Inside, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, shivered as he entered the dining hall for the first morning meal post-inspection. Despite minor improvements during the inspection, the rations had returned to their typical sparse state: watery cabbage soup, stale bread, and weak tea. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, the caloric content of typical meals in remote penal colonies averages significantly below the recommended daily intake for physically active adults. The resulting weakness, fatigue, and susceptibility to illness are widely documented. Alexei felt the strain physically and mentally. Each bite reminded him of the constant challenge: to eat enough to sustain energy without appearing greedy or disrespectful to others. The prison's environment, intentionally harsh, leveraged basic survival needs as a method of control. Tension and investigation, conflicts over scarcity. By now, the social dynamics of the cell block had intensified. Inmates had developed informal systems for rationing, trading, and hoarding portions. Unverified testimonies from former prisoners suggest that minor conflicts over food could escalate into shoving matches or verbal threats, although guards intervened inconsistently. Alexei observed that senior or more experienced prisoners often acted as gatekeepers, controlling access to extra bread, tea, or small portions of protein. These hierarchies, according to reports, reinforced compliance, as weaker inmates avoided confrontation at all costs. Survival required constant observation, subtle negotiation, and sometimes calculated restraint. The psychological weight of this system was immense. According to human rights documentation, prolonged malnutrition and enforced scarcity in Russian prisons contributes to depression, irritability, and heightened aggression among inmates. Alexei found himself thinking strategically about every meal, every exchange, every glance. Health risks escalate. Several inmates began showing visible signs of malnutrition: pale skin, trembling hands, and persistent coughing. According to BBC News, 2017, such symptoms are common in long-term prisoners exposed to inadequate diets, particularly in harsh climate. Hospitalization was rare and often delayed due to limited medical resources. An unconfirmed account circulating among inmates suggested that one prisoner had collapsed during the morning meal. While details remain unverified, it highlighted the real and immediate danger posed by the inadequate food system. Every meal was no longer simply about nutrition, it was a matter of survival. As Alexei returned to his bunk, the cold concrete walls pressing in, he realized the pattern. Hunger, hierarchy, tension, and fear were inescapable. The struggle was relentless and the stakes higher than ever. How long could a body endure this regimen before breaking under the weight of physical deprivation and psychological pressure? Every day is a test of endurance, every meal a negotiation. The line between survival and collapse is razor thin. Subscribe now to follow Alexei's struggle through the harsh reality of Russian prison life. High-stakes opening coping mechanisms emerge. By the 9th week, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, had adapted to the relentless deprivation, but survival required ingenuity. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, prisoners in remote colonies often develop coping strategies to stretch meager rations. Some hoard portions, others trade favors, and a few quietly cultivate small economies using scraps, tea, or bread as currency. Alexei observed how these informal systems maintained order in the cell block. Senior inmates monitored trades and enforced unspoken rules to prevent conflict from escalating. According to unverified inmate accounts, breaking these rules could result in physical intimidation or social ostracism, emphasizing the precarious nature of life under scarcity. Despite these adaptations, the physical toll of malnutrition was undeniable. Fatigue, dizziness, and persistent nausea were common. Reports confirm that chronic undernourishment in Russian prisons leads to measurable declines in strength, immune function, and cognitive performance, compounding the psychological stress of confinement. Tension and investigation, or social dynamics, intensify. Hunger had transformed the social hierarchy within Alexei's cell block. Inmates who controlled access to extra rations gained influence, while those without allies became increasingly vulnerable. According to human rights investigations, food scarcity can exacerbate interpersonal tensions, leading to minor conflicts that are sometimes tolerated or even encouraged by staff to maintain control. Alexei witnessed one incident where two inmates argued over a single extra slice of bread. The dispute escalated until guards intervened, separating the parties without imposing significant penalties. This aligns with documented patterns reported by the Moscow Times. 2018 Small conflicts over scarce resources are common, and staff responses are often inconsistent, reinforcing the social dynamics among prisoners. The psychological burden of this environment was immense. Inmates constantly calculated risks, weighing the need for sustenance against the potential consequences of confrontation. Alexei found himself hyper-aware of every gesture, tone, and glance, a survival skill born from repeated exposure to deprivation and tension. Rare intervention and uncertainty. During one meal, a small group of prisoners quietly received slightly larger portions, an event reported in unverified accounts from former inmates. Such interventions, whether as rewards, bribery, or administrative experiments, could shift the balance of power within the cell block. Alexei observed the reaction: whispers, envy, and subtle posturing. Every prisoner understood that these rare moments of abundance could be both a blessing and a trap. While some used the extra food strategically, others became targets of resentment or intimidation. As night fell over the prison yard, Alexei lay in his bunk, weighing the day's small victories against the relentless struggle of tomorrow. Hunger, hierarchy, and fear continued to govern every action. In this environment, the line between survival and collapse remained dangerously thin, and the lessons learned each day could mean the difference between life and debilitating weakness. Weeks of hunger, tension, and endurance have shaped every moment. The system leaves no room for weakness. Subscribe now. What you're about to see is the final chapter of Survival Behind Bars. High-stakes opening of the final struggle. By the 10th week, Alexei Ivanov pseudonym, had settled into a harsh rhythm of rationing, observation, and negotiation. Every meal was still inadequate. Watery cabbage soup, stale bread, and weak tea continued to dominate the menu. According to reports from the Russian Public Monitoring Commission, 2018 to 2019, these conditions are typical across Siberian and Far Eastern penal colonies, where remoteness, staffing shortages, and cost-cutting measures compound malnutrition. Alexei's body showed the cumulative effects: persistent fatigue, headaches, and weakened immune function. Medical documentation from human rights organizations confirms that prolonged undernourishment in Russian prisons leads to both physical and psychological deterioration, including anemia, scurvy, and heightened anxiety. The mental strain of hunger intertwined with social hierarchies, making every interaction a test of endurance and judgment. The inspection by higher authorities had long passed, and rations had returned to their baseline scarcity. Temporary relief had done little to reverse weeks of malnutrition. For many inmates, including Alexei, survival was now a matter of mental resilience as much as physical stamina. Tension and investigation of the last test. By this stage, the informal hierarchies within the cell block were deeply entrenched. Senior inmates still controlled access to extra portions or privileges, while newcomers remained vulnerable. According to unverified former prisoner accounts, disputes over minor rations continued to flare sporadically, reinforcing social tension. Alexei observed the delicate balance of fear and respect among prisoners. Those who miscalculated or angered influential inmates risked isolation, intimidation, or loss of scarce resources. Guards remained largely passive, allowing the hierarchy to self-regulate in subtle ways. Reports indicate that such dynamics are a pervasive feature of Russian penal colonies, where scarcity serves as a tool of behavioral control. Despite the ongoing struggles, prisoners demonstrated remarkable resilience. Small acts of solidarity, sharing bread, offering advice, or providing protection, helped mitigate the harshness. According to human rights documentation, these coping strategies are essential for survival and reflect the adaptive behaviors developed under prolonged deprivation. Survival and reflection. As the final days of Alexei's first month drew to a close, the full impact of the prison food system was undeniable. Chronic malnutrition had weakened his body, tested his psyche, and shaped every social interaction. Verified reports emphasize that poor nutrition in Russian prisons is both a physical and psychological tool, maintaining control through deprivation while fostering tension among inmates. Alexei lay in his bunk, contemplating the reality that survival depended on vigilance, cunning, and endurance. The temporary reliefs, occasional trades, and minor victories had not altered the fundamental truth. The system was relentless, and every meal, every glance, every interaction had consequences. Hunger was not just a condition, it was a weapon, shaping prisoners' lives day by day. The story concludes with a stark, enduring truth. In Russian prisons, food is far more than sustenance. It is a measure of control, a test of resilience, and a lens into the psychological and physical toll exacted on those living behind bars. The struggle continues for thousands of inmates, each day a delicate balance between survival and collapse.